Red Connection. Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Taylor was just getting into bed when the telephone rang. It was the duty inspector, David Hitch. He'd been called to a cottage in the grounds of the Rothay Manor Hotel in Ambleside, Cumbria, to investigate a suspicious death. When he arrived, he found the body of a woman lying face upwards in the bathroom. Telephone wire had been tied round her ankles and wrists, and over her head was a plastic bag secured with a scarf and white multi-cable flex. It was about midnight on Monday the 20th of January 1986 when Chief Superintendent Jack Taylor arrived on the scene. The dead woman was quickly identified as Bronwyn Nixon, a well-respected hotel proprietor. The pathologist was called, and arrangements were made to begin a thorough search of the house. Cumbria is the second largest county in England. It stretches from the Scottish borders to the edge of Lancashire and spans 2,653 square miles. Throughout the night, Detective Inspector Hitch had the arduous task of rounding up an inquiry team from 4 different sections of the county, each of which was requested to provide at least 3 officers, and a further 20 task force officers were also drafted in. The area surrounding the hotel needed to be combed for clues, and it was important for house-to-house inquiries to start as soon as possible. Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Taylor arranged for an incident room to be set up at Kendal Police Station, and he was keen to hold a 9 a.m. briefing. He wanted to start early so that officers could begin to check bus and railway stations and to implement road checks to discover if anyone had seen anything suspicious that night. Bronwyn Muriel Gwendolyn Nixon was 67 when she died and had owned the Rothay Manor Hotel for the past 18 years. She had originally bought the hotel itself in 1967 and Lee Cottage in the hotel grounds by 1975. She had lived there for the last 6 years. Bronwyn had been divorced for about 25 years and had 2 grown-up sons, Nigel and Stephen. After leaving Leeds University, Nigel returned to Ambleside to help his mother run the business. About the same time, Stephen decided to do the same. So in the late 1970s, a joint ownership agreement was drawn up. Bronwyn remained responsible for the kitchen, the decor and the furnishings of the hotel. Nigel was in charge of all the administration, and Stephen looked after the dining room, the wines and the staff timetable. During the past 5 years, Bronwyn had become less involved in the day-to-day running of the kitchen, leaving the job to her sons, who had both married and lived nearby. It was Stephen who had discovered his mother's body at 11:45 on the evening of Monday the 20th of January and called the police. The post-mortem was carried out in the early hours of Tuesday morning, and at 9 o'clock sharp the briefing began. Chief Superintendent Jack Taylor opened the meeting. "In the early hours of this morning," he said, "I was called out to the cottage in the grounds of the Rothay Manor Hotel. A woman's body had been discovered whom we now know to be Mrs. Bronwyn Nixon. What we're looking at is a clear case of murder. The body was found at 22:45 hours yesterday evening, and the cause of death was strangulation. The doctor estimates that she'd already been dead for at least 12 hours. She suffered an awful attack. There was bruising around the left eye, a scratch on the right side of her neck, and also a cut. Further bruising was visible by her left collarbone and on both her wrists." Jack Taylor posed some questions and reviewed what police had discovered when they arrived at the cottage. How had her attacker got into the house? There was no sign of a forced entry. Why had her attacker gone into the house? What was the motive? There was evidence of theft. There was no sign of Bronwyn's purse or its contents, which included credit cards, money and personal papers. But the violence seemed very extreme for robbery. There was no evidence of a sexual assault. Bronwyn's car, a blue Honda Accord, was missing. Did Bronwyn die because she recognized her attacker? Or did the killer have some specific grudge against her that might explain the horrific attack on her? The Rothay Manor Hotel had closed on Sunday the 5th of January 1986 for its winter break. The day after that had been chosen for the staff party at the Wordsworth Hotel in Grasmere, and most of the staff had subsequently taken a holiday, including Nigel Nixon, who went to the West Indies. The hotel was due to reopen on Friday the 14th of February, when all the redecoration and repair work had been carried out. After the staff party, Stephen Nixon returned home to look after the hotel, and Bronwyn took a short break in London with a friend. She wanted to do some shopping and to see the ballet, The Nutcracker, at the Festival Hall. On her return, because the hotel was closed, she had planned to spend more time on her hobbies. One of these was sketching and painting with a friend called John. Bronwyn had known John and his wife for about 13 years, and they sometimes stayed at the hotel. From time to time, Bronwyn and John organised painting expeditions. She was an expert on both the geography and the history of the Lake District. She usually selected a subject, and they would drive to the spot with her 2 dogs. John and Bronwyn had arranged to go painting on Sunday the 19th of January. It was quite an overcast day, but they painted for most of the day until the light began to fade. They drove back to Bronwyn's cottage at around 4:30 p.m, John remembers. We had a cup of tea and compared our day's work. We spent a fair amount of time planning our sketching expeditions during the forthcoming year. I left at 5:45 p.m. The following morning, I realised that I'd left my hat in Bronwyn's cottage, and I had found one of the dog leads in my car, so I decided to ring her at about 2 p.m. There was no reply. I was then detained at work and didn't leave the office until 9 that evening. I went for a drink and returned home at about 10:30. My wife said that Stephen Nixon had been on the phone asking if I knew where his mother was. I rang back and said that I'd last seen Bronwyn on Sunday evening. On Tuesday, the 21st of January, I rang Stephen at 8:30 a.m. He told me that his mother was dead. John was the first witness police had spoken to who admitted to being with Bronwyn Nixon several hours before her death. Because of this, he was initially treated as a suspect. He was arrested and taken to Kendal police station, where he was detained for 15 hours. He was eventually eliminated. The forensic team, who were making a detailed examination of the cottage, had found bloodstains in the hallway. There were clear signs that a struggle had taken place downstairs. Items had been knocked over, and this suggested that the attack had begun downstairs. On the lavatory lid, they found a glove mark that was lifted onto sellotape for analysis. Of even greater significance was a relatively large number of distinctive red cashmere fibres found on and around the body. There was nothing in the house that could account for these. Chief Superintendent Jack Taylor recalls, "So far this was the strongest clue we had. Nearly all the hotel staff were away, and only one neighbour had given us any useful information. She lives just down the road from the hotel, and at about 11:30 on the Sunday evening she heard a scream. When she went outside to have a look, there was nobody there. All the people we have interviewed spoke very highly of Bronwyn Nixon, and nobody could think of a reason why anyone would want to kill her." How then were the police going to find someone who hated her enough to commit such a violent act? 2 days after Bronwyn's body was discovered, the incident room received a call from Preston Police Station. They had found Bronwyn's blue Honda Accord in a multi-storey car park near the bus station. The only indication of how long it had been there was an excess charge ticket on the windscreen. Between 8 a.m. on Friday and 6:30 p.m. on Sunday, parking is free. The excess ticket had been issued at 11:55 a.m. on Monday morning, and a security man who had been on duty the previous evening, Sunday, said that when he had checked the car park between 10:30 and 11:02 p.m, the car was definitely not there. If it was the killer who had parked Bronwyn's car in the multi-storey car park, then it's not surprising that it was not there late on Sunday evening. Police now believed that it was around this time that Bronwyn was killed. Stephen Nixon had last seen his mother alive on Saturday the 18th of January. He'd been at the hotel with his wife from about 12 noon until 4 p.m. He then left to play a game of squash. Around 5 o'clock, Bronwyn drove Stephen's wife home, and later that evening she went to a fundraising concert in Preston for the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra. Stephen knew his mother was going painting on the Sunday morning, and saw both her blue Honda and John's white Cortina parked outside the cottage around lunchtime. The next day, Monday the 20th of January, Stephen arrived at the hotel at about 9:45 in the morning. He noticed that his mother's car was not there, but thought she must have gone out shopping or to visit friends. The two dogs were outside. One was roaming around, and the other was tied up in its kennel. This was unusual, because Bronwyn did not normally tether the dog until about 10 p.m. Stephen had a key to the cottage and decided to have a quick look round. He let himself in by the back door and noticed nothing amiss, though a stool was lying on its side in the hall. At 7:30 p.m, Stephen returned to the cottage. He let himself in through the same door and had a good look round the kitchen to see if there was a note, but he could not find one. By now he was beginning to worry, so decided to take the dogs home with him and ring up John, who had been with Bronwyn the day before, to ask if he knew her whereabouts. He left the message that John received on his return from the pub that evening. About 3 hours later, Stephen went back to the cottage with the dogs. Still, there was no sign of his mother. He fed the dogs, tied one of them up outside, and locked the door behind him. It then occurred to him that he hadn't checked upstairs, so he returned once more and went straight upstairs, where he saw his mother's bedroom in disarray, and found her body lying on the bathroom floor. Stephen used a nearby public telephone box to call the police. Once Stephen had been interviewed and Bronwyn's car had been found, it was important for the police to speak to anyone who had seen it, especially between Sunday evening and Monday morning. Local appeals were made for witnesses to come forward. The car, meanwhile, had been taken away for forensic examination. The only noticeably unusual features of it were that the driver's seat was pulled much closer to the steering wheel than normal, and that the back seat rest, which was generally kept folded down against the seat, was now in an upright position. However, the most significant finding was 16 red cashmere fibres on the driver's seat, identical to those found on Bronwyn's body. Meanwhile, a number of witnesses said they had seen the car. One man was driving to work between 6:50 and 7 a.m. on Monday the 20th of January when he pulled out behind it. When it stopped at traffic lights, he drew up alongside it in the near side lane. He was aware of someone staring at him, and looked across into the face of the driver, a young man between 25 and 35, with a piercing stare and dark collar-length hair. He was unshaven. It was now about a week into the inquiry, and the team was having a certain amount of success. A search for evidence continued in Preston, while back at Rothay Manor, members of the hotel's staff were being interviewed. Although the hotel was closed, and most of the staff had gone home, some 20 miles away, a waiter, having heard about the murder, contacted the police. He had a chilling feeling that he might know who the killer was, a man who had stayed with him in the staff quarters of the hotel. The waiter was called Andrew, and he had worked as a restaurant assistant at Rothay Manor for about a year. 4 months before the murder, on one of his nights off, he had gone with friends to a nightclub in Blackpool called the Flamingo Club. There he had met a man called David Wynne Roberts, who was slim and about 6 feet tall, and who had dark, almost black collar-length hair. He also had a very big moustache. Andrew recalls, "He travelled back with us all to Ambleside and stayed with me in my room. Although most of the staff knew, I didn't think the owners did. During the time he stayed, he was unemployed and drawing money from the DHSS. He was with me until Thursday the 9th of January, apart from 2 weeks when he went back to Blackpool." Andrew often told David Wynne Roberts that the situation was difficult, but the man made no attempt to leave. In fact, he frequently became quite violent. On one occasion, Andrew received a black eye and bruised nose. Andrew never made a formal complaint about Roberts' violence to the police, because he did not want to involve the hotel. Andrew told the police that David Wynne Roberts wore a silver ring on his wedding finger, which had been handed down to him by a member of his family, and also a very thin gold bracelet with a faulty catch. He drank beer, but only in halves, and he smoked quite a lot. He was also quite a show-off, claiming that he knew famous people, and that he had a sports car. Roberts told Andrew that he came from near Holyhead on Anglesey, and had left home at the age of 14. He had no noticeable accent, but spoke quite quickly, which sometimes made him seem sharp. He claimed to have lived and worked in London and Brighton. Andrew told police that during the time they were together, David Wynne Roberts became very possessive towards him and would not let him mix with other staff. They began to have arguments. As he got more and more possessive, Andrew said, I became more and more frightened of him. Sometimes he even stood in front of the door, stopping me from going out. On the night of the staff party, Monday the 6th of January, they quarrelled. David Wynne Roberts at first refused to let Andrew go to the party, but eventually relented. While Andrew was out celebrating, David Wynne Roberts stayed in his room at the hotel. Andrew wanted to go home the next day, but David Wynne Roberts insisted that he stay at Rothay Manor. I didn't really know how to handle the situation, said Andrew. I finally made up my mind to go home alone on Thursday the 9th of January. At about 9:30 that morning, I rang my father to ask him to come and help me move all my stuff. David Wynne Roberts had been very angry that morning when Andrew said he was leaving, but later he calmed down and almost pleaded with Andrew to stay with him. Eventually, he himself left, however, and Andrew noticed that £75 and some clothing were missing from his room. It was 11 days later that Andrew heard from Roberts again. He rang at about 7:30 p.m. to say that he was in Blackpool, had got a job in London, and wanted to meet up with Andrew to return the clothing he'd taken. Roberts suggested they meet in Kendal. Andrew went to Kendal with his father. It was just before 10 p.m. when they got to the car park behind the hotel where they had arranged the meeting. David Wynne Roberts returned Andrew's clothes, then said he had nowhere to stay. Andrew gave him the name of a guest house and left with his father. He wanted no further involvement with the man. The following morning, at 9 o'clock, David Wynne Roberts rang Andrew again. He said that he'd stayed out all night in Kendal and wanted desperately to meet Andrew again. Andrew refused. This information changed the direction of the inquiry. Andrew was clearly frightened of him. During one of their rows, Andrew had threatened to tell Mrs. Nixon of their relationship, which might have cost him his job. Yet was this a strong enough motive for such a savage crime? Back at the incident room, officers began checking into the background of David Wynne Roberts. It emerged that he had several previous convictions, but one stood out particularly. In July 1969, when Roberts was just 14, he was found guilty, after a 7-day trial, of stabbing a 73-year-old widow, Mrs. Sarah Hughes, several times with a bread knife at her bungalow in 4 Mile Bridge in Valley on Anglesey. Sarah Hughes was wealthy. She owned several properties in the area, which she rented out. She was described by locals as being an active community member who looked much younger than her age. She was also a meticulous woman with regular habits. Sarah Hughes was at school with Robert's grandmother and was quite friendly with his mother. Robert's father drew up the plans for the bungalow in which she lived. When the police were called to the murder scene, the bungalow appeared to have been ransacked, and an attempt had been made to drive Sarah Hughes's car from the garage. Money was missing from the house, including 10 £1 notes that had been given to her on the day of her death. Because he was an acquaintance of the deceased, David Wynne Roberts was interviewed as part of routine inquiries, and he gave an alibi. However, detectives found a number of discrepancies in his story, and after more interviews, he admitted to the murder and to attempting to drive Sarah Hughes' car away. When he was searched, £10 were found hidden in his anorak, and a search of his room revealed a book that he had hollowed out in order to hide a wallet. In the wallet were the pound notes given to Sarah on the morning of her death. He was tried, sentenced, and imprisoned. 16 years later, police inquiries concentrated on Blackpool. The Flamingo was a gay club in Blackpool's town centre. Detectives quickly established that Roberts had been a frequent visitor, and they interviewed over 500 members of the club. One of them, Chris, had been with Roberts the night before the murder. He described Roberts as about 30, 6 foot, and with an enormous black moustache. He was wearing a pale-coloured coat and a red scarf. Chris had borrowed his father's car, and he drove David Wynne Roberts to the Lord's guest house where Roberts was staying. It was about 1 a.m. They woke at about 9 o'clock. Chris recalls, "I had this funny feeling about Wynne. I wanted to go because I was feeling uneasy with him. I took a shower about 12 noon and left Wynne my telephone number." A few hours later, David Wynne Roberts rang to suggest they meet for a drink that evening, but Chris felt too tired. When Chris rang the Lord's guest house on Thursday evening, Roberts had gone. The police now knew that David Wynne Roberts was in Blackpool, 75 miles away from Ambleside, on Sunday the 19th of January, the day of Bronwyn Nixon's murder. 2 officers went immediately to Lord's guest house. The guest house was owned by Steve, who is heavily involved in the motor trade, so the day-to-day running of the business was left in the hands of his partner, John. John was on duty on Friday the 17th of January when he received a telephone call from David Wynne Roberts, who asked for a room. Roberts travelled from the railway station to the guest house by taxi. He said that he was expecting some friends from London to arrive on Sunday, and that they'd be staying all week. That night, Roberts told John that he was going to Windermere to meet an ex-lover. The following morning, Saturday, John saw Roberts at about 10:30, and remembers that he seemed quite depressed about a relationship that had ended, presumably the one with Andrew, and wanted to talk. On Saturday evening, John and Steve saw David Wynne Roberts at the Flamingo Club. He was dancing with someone whom he later brought back to the guest house. This was Chris. John saw Chris leave the following morning, although Roberts stayed at the guest house until about 4 p.m. John recalls, "On Sunday afternoon we watched the Saturday night horror movie, which we'd videoed. Roberts told me he had read the book about Dennis Nielsen, was sorry for murderers, and understood why they did it." That evening, Steve and John did not see Roberts. At about 8 o'clock, Steve went to look in Roberts' room. His belongings were still there. At around midnight, before he went to bed, Steve checked the premises and locked the doors. There had been no sign of Roberts at all. The following morning, Monday, Steve got up around 8:30. He went downstairs and saw the keys to Roberts' room on the hall table. Beside them was an envelope containing the money Roberts owed for his stay, and a note that said, "I have decided to go to London. Thank you for your hospitality." His room was empty, and the bed did not appear to have been slept in. The police were now even more anxious to trace David Wynne Roberts. The period during which he was absent from his room at Lord's guest house covered the time of the murder, and this, together with his sudden change of plan, made him the prime suspect. Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Taylor recalls, "We still had no idea where he was, and further inquiries came up with nothing. I decided to contact Crimewatch and to ask whether they would make a special appeal on our behalf. It was late in the day when I rang the production office, and I wasn't sure they'd be able to help us out. I was desperate, and I knew that a nationwide appeal was my best chance of finding him." Crimewatch only ever appeals for named suspects in the photocall part of the programme, which is made up of video recordings of robberies, together with photographs of individuals to whom the police would like to speak in connection with various crimes. This section of the programme usually consists of 4 cases, and because they have to be carefully researched, they're selected the week before the programme is broadcast. In fact, it was the very week of the programme's transmission when Jack Taylor rang the Crimewatch office. All the items for the programme had been selected. However, when Jack Taylor's call came through, his case was considered serious enough to be included in that week's programme. A meeting was immediately arranged between the producer of Crimewatch and the BBC's lawyers to discuss the implications of broadcasting such an item, as it was essential to ensure that nothing could jeopardise the eventual trial. Once a suitable form of words had been chosen, an appeal was made at the beginning of the programme on Thursday the 30th of January 1986. The results were quite remarkable. Fiona, a secretary, was at home in Cumbria watching Crimewatch, and as a picture of David Wynne Roberts flashed onto the screen, she recognised him immediately. On Sunday the 19th of January, Fiona had been staying with a friend in Lancaster. That evening she was due to get the bus home to Whitehaven at 6:40. She left her friend at around 6 p.m. to walk to Lancaster bus station, which took her about 20 minutes. She arrived in plenty of time, and waited outside the travel shop for her bus. she was joined by a tallish young man with blonde hair and 3 women. One was a student, and another was a slightly older woman with an Irish accent. Fiona remembered a man stopping to ask the Irish woman for the times of buses to Ambleside. He wore an earring and had a striking moustache. His eyes were piercing, the sort one doesn't quickly forget. Fiona remembered, too, that when the bus came, the man chatted to the bus driver about whether he could use a ticket he had. He was told that he could not, and had to pay £3 or £3.50. Eventually, she saw the man get off at Ambleside bus station. Police now knew for certain that Roberts was in Ambleside shortly after 8 o'clock on the evening of the murder. However, they were somewhat surprised by the events that followed the Crimewatch programme. Chief Superintendent Jack Taylor was sitting in the studio minutes after the programme had finished, when a phone call came through from the police station in Chiswick, West London. David Wynne Roberts had just walked in there. He told the duty officer, "My photograph appeared on Crimewatch this evening in connection with the murder of Mrs. Nixon in Ambleside. I've come here with my solicitor, as I understand you have a few questions to ask." Jack Taylor was amazed that Roberts had given himself up. He had a problem, though. As he put it, "I didn't want to start interviewing him in London when most of my officers were in Cumbria, and all the investigation had taken place there. So I dispatched 2 officers to Chiswick, and they drove Roberts through the night back to Kendal police station." On the 1st of January 1986, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act had come into force in England and Wales. The aim of the legislation had been to review all the procedures associated with the arrest and subsequent trial of a suspect, and to replace the so-called judge's rules that had formerly guided the police, which were loosely written and open to misinterpretation, with procedures that established a proper balance between the interests of the community and the rights of individuals. Among other things, the Act permits the police to hold a suspect for no more than 24 hours without bringing charges, unless he or she is suspected of having committed a grave offence. And even then, an extension to a maximum of 96 hours has to be sanctioned by a magistrate's court, at which the suspect may be present and legally represented. The Act also prescribes that a custody record must be opened as soon as someone's arrested, that all suspects must be read their rights and told that they have the right to the services of a solicitor, that interviews must be recorded and timed precisely, and that anyone under arrest has the right to request that someone, usually a member of the family, be notified of the arrest, and the right to speak on the telephone to one person for a reasonable time, although the conversation will be listened to and may be used in evidence. So Chief Superintendent Jack Taylor and his team not only had the job of investigating a murder, they had the added complication of dealing with a new body of legislation that, if breached, could threaten the success of the whole inquiry. As a consequence, they involved the Crown Prosecution Service, which is responsible for preparing criminal cases for court at a very early stage. Jack Taylor made frequent visits to London and kept the Crown Prosecution Service informed of his every move. The morning after Crimewatch, he flew back to Cumbria and held a briefing in the library at Kendal Police Station. He said, "Now there is no doubt in my mind that Roberts is our man. I want to talk about strategy. The way to approach this first interview is to try to find out exactly where he's been since he left Rothay Manor. Let's break down his alibi and see where we go from there. Don't drop the previous murder on him at this stage. I want to keep it for later." 2 officers interviewed David Wynne Roberts, who appeared calm and relaxed. One officer began, "On Sunday the 19th of January, Mrs. Nixon, hotelier of the Rothay Manor Hotel, was murdered. I believe you knew her." Roberts said, "I met her once or twice." The officer continued, "We first of all wish to know some of your movements over the period from November last year until yesterday." Roberts answered, "I came to Blackpool in November and was staying at a guest house on South Shore. I was signing on at the DHSS in Blackpool. I met Andrew from the Rothay Manor on December the 9th at a disco. That evening we drove back to Ambleside and I stayed there for about 10 days. I returned to Blackpool to sign on. Then I got the train to Oxenholme where Andrew met me and I stayed with him for about a week. Then we went to Blackpool. This carried on for about 11 weeks. Some weekends we stayed in Blackpool and others we spent in Ambleside." David Wynne Roberts said that they sometimes travelled by train, sometimes by car, never by bus. He stated that the last time he was in Ambleside was between Monday the 6th of January, the night of the Rothay Manor staff party, and Thursday the 9th of January. He saw Andrew on the 17th of January, but this was in Kendal, and he spent the weekend in Blackpool at the Lord's Guest House. He went through the events of the weekend of the murder. Everything fitted in with what other witnesses had said, but his version of what had happened on the Sunday evening did not tally with the police officer's view of what had taken place. Finally, they asked, between 4 p.m. on Sunday the 19th of January and 8 a.m. on Monday the 20th of January, did you leave Blackpool at all? No, Roberts answered. At this point, the interview was halted. Meanwhile, the two detectives who had interviewed Steve and John at the Lord's Guest House in Blackpool had a stroke of luck. The council had not collected the guest house's rubbish on the due day because it was not left in the right place. Police took 3 huge sacks to a large garage and began to search through their contents. Several hours later, at the bottom of one of the sacks, they found the corners of 2 black cards bearing the name Nixon in gold lettering. With these scraps was a tightly rolled ball of newspaper. It was an advertisement for the Royal Festival Ballet that had been cut out of the Observer newspaper, and the Nutcracker was marked with 2 red crosses. A telephone number had been written on the advertisement in black biro. Also in the bottom of the rubbish sack were 8 torn fragments of buff-coloured card, which appeared to bear the name Rothay Manor, and a letter that was signed Wynne. As a matter of course, the pieces of card were shown to Stephen Nixon, who confirmed that they were his mother's old business cards. He also confirmed that the writing on the newspaper advertisement was his mother's. More important, however, was the information that these papers would probably have been in his mother's purse. If this was the case, what was David Wynne Roberts doing with Mrs. Nixon's purse, and how had he acquired it? A detective made inquiries at the Royal Festival Hall booking office and discovered that the number written in biro on the advertisement was that of the credit card line. He was given a computer readout that showed that Bronwyn Nixon had paid for 2 tickets for the Nutcracker by credit card. More crucially, it gave the booking time as exactly 6 p.m. on the 9th of January. This proved that David Wynne Roberts had been at the Rothay Manor Hotel sometime after 6 p.m. on Thursday the 9th of January. Furthermore, if it was likely that Bronwyn had kept these papers in her purse, the only way David Wynne Roberts could have got them was if he had gone into her cottage. The police also found among the rubbish they were sifting some red cashmere fibres, which were later found to be similar to those found at the murder scene and in Mrs. Nixon's car. Meanwhile, officers at Kendal Police Station continued their interview with Roberts. He was asked, "What did you think when you saw and heard you were on Crimewatch?" He answered, "My first thought was that Andrew had informed the police that I'd been staying with him and that they wanted to question me on why I was there." "Are you quite sure the account that you have given us of your movements on the night of Sunday the 19th and Monday the 20th of January is correct?" the interviewing officer asked. "All the information I have given is correct," Roberts replied. The officer pressed him on this point. "That is not what I believe. You left the Lord's Guest House at 4 p.m. on Sunday. You were not seen again that night by anyone at the guest house. Is that right?" "The time is probably accurate," Roberts said, "but I did return to the guest house." "At 6:40 p.m. that Sunday night, you caught a bus at Lancaster and travelled to Ambleside. Is that correct?" "No," said Roberts. "You say you were in the Lord's in Blackpool at 11:45 p.m. and went straight to your room. Is that correct?" the officer asked. Roberts answered yes. "The owner of the guest house checked your room at midnight on Sunday the 19th, and you were not in the room. What do you say to that?" "If he did check it," Roberts said, "then it must have been at a different time." "Why are you telling lies, Mr. Roberts?" "I am not telling lies," he replied. A few days after the Crimewatch programme, the woman with the Irish accent who had travelled on the bus with Fiona and David Wynne Roberts came forward. She had seen details of the case in the local newspapers and had recognised Roberts' face. It turned out that she lived in Kendal, but because her sister had suffered a stroke at the beginning of January, She visited her most weekends near Blackpool. On the evening of Sunday the 19th of January, she caught a bus from Bispam to Blackpool, arriving at Blackpool depot at about 4 p.m. She had to wait an hour for her connection to Lancaster. She'd been on the bus only 5 minutes or so when she saw a man get on. He was about 30, she remembers, thinly built with dark collar-length hair. He had a large bushy moustache. I overheard him talking to the driver about going to Ambleside, and then he went upstairs. I didn't see him again until we both got off the bus at Lancaster sometime after 6 p.m. A couple of minutes later, the man approached me. He asked me which bus I was waiting for and whether it went to Ambleside. When the bus arrived, he sat next to the woman, although there were plenty of empty seats, and as she got off at Kendal, he said to her, "Take care." The police now had several witnesses who claimed to have seen Roberts on the bus on Sunday the 19th of January. He still denied that he had left Blackpool that day, so they decided to hold an identification parade. Roberts refused, on the grounds that his photograph had been shown both on television and in the press. Finally, the police had to arrange for him to sit behind a one-way mirror and be confronted by the witnesses, which was another option provided for by the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. In order to allow all the witnesses to confront David Wynne Roberts, the police needed more time. They had already been granted several extensions by the Magistrates' Court, and this was going to be their last chance to keep him in custody. Chief Superintendent Jack Taylor explained to the court that Roberts was going to be seen by several witnesses who might identify him, after which he'd be either released or charged. After a short hearing, the police were granted a further 36 hours. Jack Taylor recalls, "We had to keep David Wynne Roberts because after the initial interview he refused to answer any more questions, and we had a number of outstanding witnesses to approach. He also had a previous conviction for murder in similar circumstances." During his interview, Roberts had given the police the name of a Maltese friend, Renato, with whom he had stayed in London. 2 officers went to visit him. Renato had met Roberts in late December 1984 at a gay club in London. They had kept in touch through letters and phone calls ever since. On Monday the 13th of January, he'd arrived at Heathrow Airport, and Roberts had met him. They spent several days together, but on Friday the 17th of January, Roberts told Renato that he was going to Blackpool and was planning to stay at the Lord's Guest House. At about 3 a.m. on either the Saturday or the Sunday morning, he telephoned Renato. He said that he was all wet and outside in the middle of nowhere. He mentioned the name Kendal. He gave no indication that he was thinking about coming back to London. Renato next heard from him on Monday the 20th of January, when Roberts told him that he was returning to London and asked Renato to meet him at Euston. They spent some more nights together before Renato went to visit an uncle in Bristol on the 30th of January. He recalled that sometime after Roberts had returned from Blackpool 10 days earlier, they had exchanged several articles, some of them clothes. He said, "I exchanged my black and white scarf for a red one that Wynne was wearing." He said that it irritated his neck. He'd bought it in Harrods last year for £25. He gave me his beige shoes and a pair of boots. He said that his feet were cold when he wore them. He also gave me a pair of black leather gloves and a grey wallet. He said the gloves had belonged to his friend Andrew from Kendal. Wynne said that he couldn't grip with them and that I could have them. He said he'd washed them. The wallet wasn't the type I would use, but I kept it and thought maybe I'd give it to my sister. Detectives could not believe what they had found. They now had a red cashmere scarf that had belonged to David Wynne Roberts in their possession. If the fibres matched those discovered on Bronwyn's body, in her car and in the rubbish, they had the strongest possible evidence against David Wynne Roberts. It was an enormous stroke of luck, not least because Renato was due to fly back to Malta the very next day and could easily have taken this vital piece of evidence with him. On the day that police in London spoke to Renato, the confrontation between Roberts and several witnesses took place in Kendal. These included the man who had seen him driving the blue Honda on the morning of Monday the 20th of January, and Fiona, who had seen Roberts get off the bus at Ambleside the evening before that. When the witnesses walked into the room, David Wynne Roberts was sitting behind a mirror. He could not see them, but he could hear everything that was said. 4 out of 5 people positively identified him. When further questions were put to him, he refused to answer any of them. Forensic experts had meanwhile examined the red scarf, and fibres taken from it matched precisely in colour and in microscopic appearance those already found during the investigation. On the 3rd of February 1986, 3 days after the Crimewatch programme, David Wynne Roberts was charged with the murder of Bronwyn Nixon. In court, he pleaded not guilty, so the motive for the murder may never be known. Did Roberts blame Bronwyn Nixon for the breakup of his relationship with Andrew? Or did he have some other grudge against her that has never been revealed? Whatever the truth of it is, on the 1st of December 1986 at Manchester Crown Court, Roberts was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. He's continued to deny his involvement with the crime. End